allow us the opportunity to express ourselves multidimensionally all in one moment. I can be in body, I can be operating in thoughts and emotions, I can be operating in virtue, and I can be operating from this source, all simultaneously, stacking these multidimensional realities and choosing to move consciously that way, which opens up the entire capacity of the human organism to really express itself in any meaningful way. Everything else that we do, if we're only operating in one dimension or a series of, smaller dimensions, not our whole totality, we're always going to feel unfulfilled in some way.
Welcome to the Consciousness of the Way. I am your humble servant and seafood, Taoist Master San Qing. And you've heard it here before. I'm not tired of it. I'll just keep repeating myself. It's Christmas morning. I come down to the tree, and the universe has brought me this incredible being. I want to welcome to the podcast Phoenix Aurelius, a explorer of many things, a master of the alchemical process, external and internal. I welcome you to the podcast, dear friend. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me, San Qing. It's absolutely fantastic to be here, and yeah, I'm excited to have some good conversations here today.
Yeah. And this is what this podcast is about, diving deep into good conversation and raising the frequency. And as my dear friend James Tooney would say, expanding the spiritual consciousness, something that is a little bit more defined as opposed to consciousness per se, which could potentially from a psyche perspective, be some type of psyop. But hey, we won't go there. We'll just start with the basics. And I mean, you have got an incredible background in a seeker, explorer, cultivator, and a master of many things. I would love you to share with the audience a little bit about yourself leading up to this point.
Sure, yeah. So basically, by fate and fortune, when I was 16, I got interested into spagyria, which at that time I didn't really know what that was. But what I did know was that sitting around smoking pot in the forest with a dislocated ankle, I was looking around at the plants and realized, like, wow, I have absolutely no idea what any of these are or what they do. I don't know their names. I don't know their functions, either ecologically or medicinally. And it was just kind of like this big wake up moment. Like, I see these things all the time as I'm walking through the woods, and I have never stopped to know their names. I've never stopped to know what they do, what their function is, or why they exist. And why do some of these grow in my ecosystem where they don't grow in other people's ecosystem, and vice versa. And it was just kind of like an existential realization that really hit me hard. And still being in high school, I had just transferred from a Catholic school to a public school. And so I had so many more credits than what I absolutely needed, that by the time my junior year rolled around, I had a ton of time for independent study. And so I just go into the computer lab, and this was in the early days where Yahoo was kind of the big search engine. We had Yahoo forum groups and things like that. And I would search around and just try and find, like, what are the most advanced ways of preparing herbs? Because I've always kind of, I never started at the bottom and climbed my way up the ladder. The goal was, let me pogo stick up to the top rung. And so that was kind of the idea. And I was looking for the most advanced ways of working with and preparing herbal medicine. I came across this little flow chart from the Philosophers of Nature, which was an alchemical group in the 80s and 90s, that said how to make a spagyric tincture. And there wasn't any specific instructions. It was just a flow chart. And so I was able to kind of piece things together, and still being younger than 21 and living in the United States, I had to send some of my older friends, skateboarder friends, to the liquor store for me to buy bottles of 95%, Everclear grain spirits, basically. And I would just go up into nature and I would harvest the herbs, and then I would hang them, just using twine from trees in the summer months, and let them naturally air and sun dry and cure in the shade of the trees, of course. And haul up my mason jars, and I would use little stainless steel condiment containers as crucibles, and use aluminum foil to cover it as I set it in the fire, so that other ash wouldn't get inside of my little crucibles and things like that. And it was just a very humble process, but it got me deeply connected with nature, understanding how to harvest and work with the herbs that I was finding around me, and just kind of building up my skill level until I think I was 17. I was almost 18, and I decided that I was going to build my first still. And I found some really rudimentary plans online on how to take an oversized teapot and use cork and some copper tubing in order to build a still. And I was able to rig it up inside of the creek so that my condenser water was constantly being filled full of nice, fresh flowing water in order to cool things down. And I would also use the fresh spring water that was there in order to fill up my vessel. And I ended up harvesting a bunch of yarrow herb, flowering yarrow. This was in like late July, and ended up putting all of that into a vessel. And I saw the essential oil come over, and it distilled blue. And I had never distilled an essential oil before. This was a completely novel experiment for me. There were only a few tiny drops because I was working with a relatively small amount of biomass. But I just remember those blue drops floating on the top of my water as everything was collected in my receiver, and it just blew my mind. I was just like, are you kidding me? There's a blue oil inside of this plant. And of course, I didn't know that. I wasn't expecting that. And I just was hooked. It was like, okay, alchemy for life. This is it. And so, or at least at that time, spagyria for life. I didn't know that it was part of the alchemical tradition. A couple of years later, I ended up talking with a friend. She said, man, your remedies are so potent. I don't know what you're doing. And we compared notes, and she said, well, what you're doing are spagyrics. I said, yeah, I know. That's what it says right here on this thing, how to make a spagyric tincture. She's like, well, herbalists don't learn that. That's like a next step up. That's part of the alchemical tradition. My eyes just got, huge. This saucer plates. It's like, alchemy? Really? That's part of the alchemical tradition? She told me that the largest alchemy school in the entire world was here in my home state, and that I would probably be able to take a look at it. And so I researched it. Unfortunately, it closed 2 years before I was even born, but that put me on a path of reaching out to all of the surviving students of that school and finding out what they had learned and working with them. And just so happened, again, by fate and fortune, that one of the students who was also a secretary for the school ended up saying that she wanted to get rid of most of her labware and was selling it. And I called her, and she said, well, when will you be able to come by? I said, I don't know, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. She was thinking, weeks, months, whatever. I said, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes. She said, oh yeah, sure, please come on down. I did. And she just saw a spark inside of me. And she said that I had a lot of traits that were very similar to Frater Albertus, and that she felt that I would be well suited to these materials. So she donated her entire laboratory and almost her entire library to me as well, which was filled full of Kabbalistic texts and Rosicrucian materials and tons of alchemical texts and facsimiles of old alchemical manuscripts and things like that, that she had made notes in and like dog-eared, and had, all of her journals and all of these things, as well as things from the Paracelsus Research Society, which was that alchemical school here in Salt Lake. And so I was able to get experimental data of these experiments, all of the lab notes from guys like Jack Glass and Frater Albertus himself, and Viola and Norm Engel, and a couple of really big names in 20th century alchemy. And that just kind of catapulted my path like crazy. I dove head into that. And alongside that, I'd already been very interested in healing just in general. So I'd been dabbling in things like Tibetan medicine and Ayurveda and Unani medicine, and Chinese medicine to a smaller degree at that time. Definitely had studied a lot of psychic work and psychic development work in the kind of tradition of Louis Bostwick and the Berkeley Psychic Institute, and was already into crystal healing and, lots of different types of eclectic and metaphysical types of things, and had a strong mystical slant towards any sort of literature. And so, yeah, all of those things kind of culminated when I started practicing alchemy. And I just found that it put all of my interests and all of the unique talents that I had developed where I didn't really know where they had fit in earlier on in life, especially being a young American kid. Like, where, how do you, potion making? What the hell? I don't know. Like, there's not really a life path for that, so to speak. And so it put everything into context for me. And 20 years later now, here I am still doing the same thing, just on a more professional level, and actually studying it and creating a tradition that I will be able to pass on, that will be intact and hopefully built onto by the students that I have, and their students after them, for centuries and centuries. So that's kind of the idea.
Blammo.
Blammo.
That's what I'm talking about. I mean, this is the spark that sort of generates, people's seeking, whatever it is that is visceral, that is this embodied sort of knowing that this is where I'm, like the charge you're getting right now up your spine. It's like the knowing now, the chill that you're getting. And I see auras, I see energy, energy, frequency, vibration. That's it. That's my bag, baby. So that's part of the clear senses that I train people in, and that is an alchemical process on the micro version of the macro. And when you get that down, you supercharge things like all the things that you're deep into when you imprint with your love, your attention, your focus and intention, is how you create such super potent sort of tinctures. They're you ain't playing, but it's like part of imprinting is it's sort of conceptual. People sort of run with it. They see a couple of episodes of Harry Potter and they get inspired and they want to go down that route, and they don't have a real map or method to make that realized, because Hollywood is really just hinged on reality, and it depends on what degree. I've over the 30 years of me experiencing my journey consciously with the Tao, and channeling Lao over 30 years ago, and he's my teacher to this day on a second-to-second basis. I have over 171 teachers within my cultivational space, which in the New Age spiritual world, they would call these immortals that I lean on as facets within a Taoist system. We call it the diamond. They are facets of the diamond, windows into the mother, the Tao, all things, the Wu Ji, the stillness. And that is how you and I have dialogue, and then it becomes a monologue where all things are realized, right? And so that's sort of like so powerful. But the imprinting part is like the secret sauce. A dear friend of the channel I had on recently, Jules, she has found through her own seeking, found her own version, and not within an ancient system that is more, realized by myself. I mean, the stuff that was given to me by my monasteries is child's play compared to the stuff that was given to me directly by the seekers and creators of this information, being directly from Lao Tzu, directly from the Yellow Emperor. I go into conference with the Yellow Emperor on a daily basis. I mean, what people don't understand is the Yellow Emperor's mentor was the Jade Emperor on a higher level, Jade Purity, and then their mentor was truly the universe, and the universe is the expression of the mother. And all of a sudden you have these filterings of this whispering, and then you get the foundations of Chinese medicine that you referenced earlier. But the truth is that's all diluted gobbledygook compared to what the Yellow Emperor peeled off and revealed through his intimate relationship with the universe. And that was from his own words, when he was instantly connected as he came down from a celestial, riding a celestial dragon to planet Earth. I mean, the stuff, you can't make it up. And when I tell these stories, people freak out because they get chills like you do. It's like, holy crap, this is real. Yes, it is. 100%. You can feel it. And, he spent 18 days and 18 nights magnetized to planet Earth. Just couldn't move. downloading everything that you know as the Chinese culture, even the butchered part over the last 7 emperors leading up to B4, you know, oracle bone reading, and of course pictographs, and what is visible within Chinese culture as potentially some sort of like timeline, which has been really doctored and diluted and distorted. It's distorted. None of the stuff that comes out of China, you can't trust any of it. I just, heads up to everyone. Whatever you're reading, whatever you have access to, is because you're allowed to. It's not because it's the real stuff. And this is the problem with the filtering system within that culture. And, you know, I'm just excited that a brother from another mother, we're going to get up to some Harry Potter stuff, man. Collaboration, I can see it coming, because my journey here is to show people a level of consciousness. That's it. Awaken and have them return to remember who they really are. And you use these facets, you use these incredible lenses to expand what you see, what you know, what the truth is. And it's realized through your exploration. And so you're cultivating this stuff, and you're documenting, you're creating a foundation that can be repeatable. And that's something that I'm very much in tune with, and my teachers on a daily basis. It's very important to attune yourself into a repeatable sort of like system. That's why Taoist alchemy is so sexy to most people, yet they can't find it, is because still to this day, people lean on it. You've spoken about many systems, but I think the closest sort of like inner peaking of what would be a different version of Taoist alchemy would be Rosicrucian alchemy. So you have sort of like a similar vibe to it. And when you listen to Steiner's sort of like speaking on his exploration and through his own documenting of his version of it, what he's shared with the world, what people tap into, there are traits of really powerful stuff that could possibly be parallel to the Taoist alchemy that I teach people. And I'm like, yeah, this is the real stuff.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, man, that's kind of my same experience, is like, you know, when we talk about Yellow Emperor or Jade Emperor connecting deep into the cosmos, and like you said, like kind of being magnetized to the earth for a period of time, I think that just about every person who gives themselves the opportunity to really put themselves aside and put their preconceptions aside, and to try and perceive things as close as they can to how they quote unquote really are or truly are, they end up with answers that are more or less the same, even if they end up getting filtered through a cultural lens or through the individual's unique understanding of things. Because, you know, some of the ideas cosmically that come to us are so much greater than the terminology that we have in our own languages, that we have to draw metaphor. We have to oftentimes explain things through metaphor. It's like this, or it's as this, you know, using similes and metaphors in order to explain the vastness of reality, the way that we are able to kind of pick up and perceive it as antennas to a greater cosmological radio frequency that's out there, so to speak. And, you know, for me, I think the real beauty in it is taking a look at all of the surviving cultures and mystical writings and metaphysical works and physiological works and everything else, and trying to see what are the perennial principles that remain the same and remain unaltered throughout these traditions, because there are undoubtedly a great deal of similarities. And how can I draw on that perennial tradition and make something that has extended throughout all cultures and throughout all times that we know of, and be able to preserve that to some degree with terminology, with methodology, with etc., you know, whatever the techniques are that are going to hand that more easily to the next generation, so that it's less at risk of getting lost or diluted over time. And yeah, I very much so fall in line with that. And yeah, I guess that's just my own take, my own perspective on things.
Well, that's kind of like it's a really fundamental gnosis that comes with the experiential now that you can't make up. It's like a visceral kinesthetic thing that you just don't. It's like
Yeah,
I know. I don't have to. And as the Jade Emperor always reminds me, when you accept you know nothing, you know everything.
yeah,
And
yeah, exactly. The cup has to be empty in order to be full.
and you know you can't make this stuff up. I mean, I get counsel from Lao Tzu on a second by second basis, but then when people want to have an experience of, you know, the embodiment of his resonance within this physical body, I do little channeling moments, and people experience it. They're like, holy crap, I can feel this through the computer. This is like this incredible energetic charge. It's palpable because it's not from this electromagnetic spectrum. It's a whole different wave. It's a whole different energy. And this is what people talk about when you tune into that. Some people would twist it within this new age language of quantum physics. And, I'm cool with that. I don't mind that. Having epiphanies of realizing that it's another gnosis. But the truth is it's not a scalar wave. It's beyond that. It's beyond the zero. People refer to the 0 point. And I would say the closest thing you would come to that is the Wu Ji, the stillness between the breath in and the breath out. That's what we're speaking of. The now, this present moment. Yeah. And, it's conceptual for a lot of people until otherwise noted, till they come across an incredible master like yourself or someone like myself that can share with them actual, repeatable, cultivational practices that will bear fruit in this 3D reality. You will be able to harness that not of this world, because what is the definition of that? Why is it not of this world? Because this world has been created and sort of molded due to the intention of the individual and the collective that has changed it into what you would perceive as matter, which is slowing the speed, slowing the frequency, slowing the vibration, and changing the energy. That's all it is. But it all is cut from the same cloth. Yeah. So when you can decipher that and you can realize that it's that monotone, monologue, then all of a sudden things become real. And, crazy things like manifestation, what I call magic, which is a very detailed, layered manifestation using all the energetics within the systems I train people. You become the human body dowser. So you're able to identify consciously. This is the thing. If you're emotional, you're suggestible. One of the first things we need to get off the table is that the human condition is potentially a distraction. And once you identify and become the observer, and that emotional content, the sum of your life experiences is nothing more than that, and you can be the now, you can tell the emotions to go and sit in the corner, roll over, play dead. I don't want you to erase your personality. I want you to realize that the present moment has nothing to do with you. And you have that monologue, and all of a sudden things happen. And what does that mean to the audience? It's like, if you realize you are all things, which is what we talk about, the mother, you're not asking yourself, hey, could you give me a healing? Could you possibly manifest this thing? That's where you're having a dialogue, which makes you separate. And that's okay. It's just, as you start to identify that, we want to have alchemical processes. And I always lean on that because things become palpable as you shift through this, as James would say, spiritual consciousness. There are degrees within the system I teach people. There's over 9 layers to that till you become one. So your conscious is your default. That means it's 24/7, as Lao Tzu would teach people: concept, consciousness, knowing, unconscious knowing, and then being all things. That's it. And that's like the cycle within the teachings that I share with people. And I think it sort of resonates with you, and you probably have similar sort of like perhaps perceptions of how you create your alchemy. I would love you to share that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have been perhaps most influenced by the Western traditions, and specifically, I think most influenced through Rosicrucian types of teaching. So the terminology that we use is, particular or peculiar to that particular tradition. But when you stand back and you say, what is the essence of what is being expressed here? You can draw upon the similarities, you can draw upon the consistency behind everything. Like, for instance, when you were talking about the different states of knowing and being, all of those to me are just multifaceted aspects of consciousness in its elemental forms. So we begin to see that these kind of holographic and fractal patterns constantly repeat each other. And I think that the mystical speaks to the mystical, no matter what, like what language you're speaking. If you can just stand back and say, okay, I'm prepared for foreign terminology. What are the descriptions of these things? Or what is the feeling, the essence behind these, word packages that unpack these more elaborate thoughts? You can begin to pick up on what the basis is. And it's more or less cosmic. Like you said, there's, monologue, one logos, which is one logic or one sense of knowledge that is behind everything. And when we have that monologue, we identify as that source of creation and that source of being, and can begin to see all of the different layers of how it goes from this very, very high vibrational state into more condensed physical types of states. And then we can begin to unpack all of those layers between that monologue and the dialogue, so to speak, in order to see that there is a lot in there, and that all of these intermediary steps are the things that lead us from physical, hard, dense, tangible consciousness into a very subtle, piercing, omniscient type of frequency.
Yeah. When I get people supercharged and leave the lights on, like that Motel 6 ad, when you leave the lights on, when you are the plutonium dump site of spiritual consciousness, and it is resonating at a frequency that alters all things, that wherever you walk, it's a vaporizing effect that ripples out into everything. And so how do you know this? A great example when I start tuning people is the subject to the side effect of a dualistic sort of like presence. So when people move into a space, and most people, until they have that memo, that upgrade, they're operating in what they perceive as their reality, which is up and down, in and out, left and right, good and bad. And with that, you're subject to your emotions. You're subject to perceptions that are limited by what that means to you right now. From I am the emotion, I am the event, I am that place, person, or thing, and that separates you. But someone that's resonating, that is this present moment, has a rippling effect on everything around them, as is all things, because now you're bringing in the remembrance. You're giving people what we call the glimpse of the truth. I honestly, I'm a little apprehensive when people talk about absolute truth, but it's a truth for them. And that's what's going on. They're having a moment to remember who they are, and they didn't get the memo when the music stopped. And so all of a sudden, holy moly, you're the reason why I feel this way. And it's like people will gravitate to you like a moth to a flame, or they will be repelled by you. And that's just part of this construct. And it's kind of interesting because most people talk about, oh, well, this is the 3D. And, some of my students are like, Jifu, you always go past that. You go 3 to 5. You never talk about the four. Well, the truth is, you are the four. If you truly have an understanding of what's going on as an observer, when you first start out on your journey, you're seeking gnosis, you're going to find out you're already there. It's not like, oh, I'm in the three and I'm going to move through time and space and I'm going to get into the fifth dimension. And these are all, conceptual, but they're gears of awareness that someone can kind of sink their teeth in and get a sort of fundamental understanding of. And then you blossom into your own version of that. But let's just sort of roll these out to give you some sort of like framework. And a lot of people discover the quantum model as being something that helps them get a better handle, whatever it takes. There's a million ways up the mountain. There's no right or wrong way, but that fourth dimensional realization is an epiphany for most. They're like, well, because you are separating yourself. People are like, well, we go from the fourth dimension to the fifth. You're already in the fourth dimension. People seem to forget that. It's kind of like reading The Secret and going, that crap didn't work. Yeah, because they were separate. That the understanding of that whole message was you separating yourself from true source, from the now, which made it fundamentally disappointing for most people. And they're like, I read it and I spent all this money and it didn't happen. Because what's the one question that will hold you up is they always go back to, what are your values? I'm honestly surprised that people didn't notice that sooner. When I share it with people, they go, that's why it didn't work. Have you come across The Secret? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, and to talk about values and principles and virtues, I think is the missing piece that people really miss, that Abraham Nestor Hicks did not even really touch on too much. So many times, first of all, the whole concept of The Secret, the whole concept of this concept of unadulterated manifestation, you have to get into the concept of what unadulterated actually means. What they were promoting, in my opinion, is adulterated manifestation. Take the things that you value, that you want, and draw them to you, regardless of where they come from, why they come that way, or what the effects are. There's no causal awareness whatsoever about those things. And what I've noticed about people who are in lower states of consciousness to where they would want to use concepts of manifestation is that the states of depravity of human condition already govern their lifestyles to such a degree that they would want more of the things that are not good for them, or more of the things that have a negative impact on others, or that rely on some form of slavery or indentured work or whatever else in order to supply those things. There's no concept of the causality behind the manifestation. So that's one state of consciousness. And in my opinion, this is also the realm of what we could conceive of to be as like black magic or dark magic, is that it's self-serving, regardless of the cost to other beings or entities. And this goes very much so back in the Western esoteric tradition to the adulteration that happened with Aleister Crowley as well, is that we see do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law being his entire mantra of dilemma. And there is that, and you can just live in that if you stay in a complete state of depravity. It's all about your own senses, your own sense of gratification, your own sense of having, belonging, etc. But it's so tied into the physical that once you leave, you can't take any of that with you. I had a very, very good friend named Luke Garcia who wrote a song one time that said, take what you want to the grave, but you can't fit it all into your pocket. And I think that that's a really important thing, is like, only the virtuous aspects of our being that have been tied between the spirit and the soul are the eternal aspects that take into account causality to any degree. And so from the Western perspective, we have, elemental associations with the physical plane being the element of earth. We have the astral plane being the element of water. And this deals, the astral plane, for lack of a better term, is anything within the scope of electromagnetism. The entire spectrum of electromagnetism is the astral. It's where our thoughts exist. It's where our emotions exist. And those are places where most magicians are operating, is just on that astral. But if we go one step above that to the element of air within, again, the Western tradition, then we begin to see this causal plane, which is really the binary coding of all of existence from there downwards. It's the zeros and the ones, the active, the passive, the yin, the yang of absolutely everything that create these short codes that encode all of the rest of creation. Why is that important? How does that tie into magic? Well, from my perspective, if you are just working on a value-based system and using your thoughts and emotions to try and manifest things, you're only working on the astral. When you actually take into account what are the principles of the universe, the principles of the world that make things tick, and then we align our value systems with those principles, that alignment is what creates virtue. And virtue is a perennial thing that is ubiquitously spread across all of creation, regardless of its multidimensional composition, enabling the human individual to begin to operate on a much more significant level, where you begin to see that, wanting money is a value because you value money. Having things provided for you, that is something that nature already abundantly offers in every ecosystem everywhere. The very fact of that is that wherever humans and or animals and or plants exist, they are provided for. The concept, the principle of provision exists abundantly for anybody who would go out and seek it. And so when you can say, I align my value system to understand the principle of provision, when you do that, you can draw limitless abundance to you or provision to you by just simply aligning that value system with the principle and noticing how it exists everywhere and choosing to act within the framework that the moment gives you. Because if you're not present with the moment and what it's already providing you, because provision is everywhere, it's abundant. If you're not aligning it, then you're not looking for what is already there, or not looking for what is already being given to you, but instead wanting something outside of that principle. That drops the dimensional frequency immediately. You cannot exist in that causal dimension, which most people would refer to as like fifth through seventh dimension in modern kind of theosophical based metaphysics, because you're limited to that fourth dimensional perspective, astral, or even, less into the physical third dimensional perspective. So, I have to agree with you. I think that, so frequently and so often, the human condition teaches us what is real, what is tangible, what is solid. And therefore, most individuals choose to engage or don't even realize that they can engage on higher levels than perhaps the third dimension. And what I applaud most of the magical works of, I would say, at least easily the last 400 or 500 years in the West, and most of the cosmological traditions that extend from ancient time, the Vedas, the Taoist traditions, we begin to see that there are ways of existing in being in harmony and in solitude and in solidarity, I guess I would say, with the source of all things, the Tao, if we want to refer to it through that cultural lens, that allow us the opportunity to express ourselves multidimensionally, all in one moment. I can be in body, I can be operating in thoughts and emotions, I can be operating in virtue, and I can be operating from this source, all simultaneously, stacking these multidimensional realities and choosing to move consciously that way, which opens up the entire capacity of the human organism to really express itself in any meaningful way. Everything else that we do, if we're only operating in one dimension or a series of, smaller dimensions, not our whole totality, we're always going to feel unfulfilled in some way. We know that our potential is greater, and we end up confusing experiences or things or whatever, as the thing that we want to achieve next that might bring us the happiness. But when we obtain those things, when we achieve those things, the human condition says, well, what next? What next? What next? What next? And it's a never-ending cycle. The only way to bring stillness to that being is to incorporate all these dimensional realities simultaneously. Then the human organism ends up feeling fulfilled because it is expressing itself in a way that is intended to express itself in its totality. So that would kind of be my own narrative, my own perspective on things.
Amen to that, brother. I mean, it's like listening to you. A lot of my students and the OGs of the channel will be like, did you give him a script before he came on here today? Because this is truly, when I teach people Nidan, the internal alchemy, this is the very understanding. And when you access, and I work in all dimensions at once. That's how and I wouldn't even use the word work. I am present in this very moment in all dimensions. That's it. That's how it works. That's the monologue. And when you do that, all of a sudden, you are abundant, timeless, endless, limitless, infinite. And so when I teach people how to read auras or give someone a psychic reading, if I want to just dilute it by its definition, but I do enjoy I live out here in Nevada, so I teach my kids all things paranormal, sort of the ability to access dimensions at will, remote viewing, energetic healing. They wet their whistle at a very young age. The simplicity of hypnosis. They understand all these things. So our family day is going down to the strip and walking up to a group of people that are having a good time anyway. And it's like, would you like to experience bliss and complete, like, an evidence of God right now? And they're like, yeah. And, you have these epiphanies, and my kids like doing it, but it's what we call a psychic reading, a psychic expansion. And, it'll be sort of a little extreme, but, we look at all the energy centers from a Taoist perspective. We don't really call them chakras. They're dantians, but it's the attachment to the earth. And then we go up to 7 that someone would call 7 chakras. And then we have, the entry point to the universe. So we start at 9 and we continue to multiply by 9. And this is where a lot of people, they go, oh, I've got this program. It's a Qigong training program. I'm like, okay. It has 40 principles and sorry. What are you talking about? Because the real misdirection of Taoist processes and alchemical practice and the secret source, everything comes in 9. I don't care what you talk about, how you talk. And the second someone goes to 16 principles, no. And people are like, what? Listen, this is the misdirection. And when you look at the 3 creators that we have, 3 of my teachers, which is Supreme Purity, Jade Purity, Highest Purity, which are the keepers and the creators of the cosmos, there's a misdirection right there when you see any image or value of them, because Supreme Purity, which is an immortalized another resonance of Lao-Tzu, is actually formed from face value. You see him on the left, but he's actually on the right. So when you move his image to the right and you turn the reflection of what you perceive as that image and you turn it and alter it in the other direction, the energy just goes through the roof. And people are like, whoa. So whenever you see any representation of the 3 pure ones within my temple, within anything that I share in materials, it's the mirror image. And what happens is, on a much deeper level, people don't understand that, the polarizing effects of these things. So from a numerological perspective, we're going in reverse. We go to the power of 9, and then we go back down to the mother at the 0. And these magnitudes of these 9s become more and more relevant as you go deeper into the alchemical process. So I just finished transcribing with Lao-Tzu his 2024 version of Tao Te Ching, which as a Taoist is what we call the magical register. And when people hear that, they go, whoa, holy moly, that is, I don't know why you said that, but that means, like, makes sense to me, because every verse is an incantation, and every incantation has different levels of awareness that you're creating, and they have different degrees, and with that, it's a frequency and a color. And people are like, holy moly, that makes sense to me. I have no idea what you're saying, but the Tao Te Ching has a different meaning to me right now. And when you read the stuff that we've published, the words come off the page, they spin around you, and they drop right into your middle dantian, and you get charged like a mofo. And people are like, "What? This is unreal." Yeah, it is, and I don't mind you using that word. I wouldn't use it too much because it is reality. It's not fantasy. It's the truth. And so that visceral experience that you're having is your register of reality. If you are thinking, you are not knowing. If you're knowing, you're feeling. That's it. That's where it comes from. And the more you synchronize these energy centers, it becomes revealed. So I really appreciate it when you talk about the virtue, because when we're looking at energy centers, I just look at the energy centers, the 5 vital organs, which have spirits that protect those particular organs. And within each energy center, there is an emotion of virtue attached. And when you regulate the emotion, the virtue is revealed. And from that means that you may have started your journey with this realization. You get into the deep alchemy practices I teach people, and then all of a sudden, their version of love when they first started was razor blades and bunny rabbits. And over a progression of dialing in and synchronizing to that signature of all things, you tap into that universal unconditional love, the mother of all things, the Tao. But until further notice, you're subject to your perception. You're subject to duality. You're subject to the very limited framework of human condition. If you want that to saturate, if you want to be the master keeper creator of the 50 trillion cells that is represented as your flesh and blood, that you are holding the keys to, that you look in the mirror and you perceive as your identity, and you want to supercharge that and be in line as a multi-dimensional realized now, that comes with the resonance. And once you hold that energy, vibration, frequency, and then you get that, you're able to hold that resonance of that frequency, it's on like Donkey Kong. It's a whole new reality. Whoa, all of a sudden things become instantaneous. So the universal now is realized. You may have had this limited subjective view of reality, and as you hold that resonance, it dissolves the emotional content that you're holding within this physicality, and you become resonant at that level, and you're conscious. You're, as James would say, spiritually conscious as a default. That's your reality. That's how it works. And so there's a fundamental shift where you can literally, and I do this, guys, a little bit more, it becomes a little bit more revealing, but you could possibly stereotype guys as being visual guys. Now, everyone has their own sensory perception entry level as you're dropping in there, but I quickly instantly read what that perception is, and then that lens becomes leveled out, because that's the biggest problem. You're using these sensory perceptions to develop a dialed in knowing, and so you want to regulate that with that emotional state. And so when that comes in, all of a sudden the virtue becomes revealed, and now you're off to the races. Now all of a sudden you can literally attempt to think about something that might be problematic, potentially conjure up some sexual encounter, and it will dissolve. You will not be able to create that. You literally have a void, a black space that within seconds, because here's the key part. Most people don't realize this. Jade Emperor reminds everyone, all thoughts of your mind are not yours. what? What? What are you talking about? I'm like, listen, I mean, I don't want to give you a real crash course, and I do it sometimes. I don't do it often, but I'll literally plant a thought in someone's mind, and they'll be like, "Yeah, I have this credit." No, I gave you that. And they're like, "What are you talking about?" Here's the piece of paper I wrote it on 10 minutes ago, and they're like, oh, I didn't get a heads up. I wasn't even aware. That's my thought. And then that's why the method of training is critical to your realization. You need to have a very clear understanding, and it comes to you in the feeling. And when you develop your clear senses, you're able to see it, because a lot of people get feelings and they're like, I can't really see anything, but I get a feeling. I don't know where it's coming from. If you're a light worker, an alchemist, a herbalist, a Chinese medicine practitioner, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, whatever you are, and I work with all of them, they all get tired. And I'm like, really? That's one of the first things that you have an issue with. I'm exhausted. What? Why are you exhausted? This is coming from the framework of fear. Fear is the starting catalyst, right? Let's just realize it. That's it. And so with that, you're going to walk into, as Phoenix and I are here, you are me, I am you. What is there to be any fear of any kind? So if there's a little dink in your armor and you have this question that's going on about what you need to be protected about, it's all about synchronizing your resonance, that you don't have to be fearful of anything because you are the now. But there is a progression that takes you to that place. It's very conceptual and a bunch of rambling words to most people when they start, because they're steeped in their emotional state. But there needs to be this developed skill. And that's what I realized within Rosicrucian is this. They've got a really deep lens that I thought was really cool, that was similar to the stuff that I'm teaching people, in the depth of moving through and creating a construct that will be self-evident. And that self-evident is that feeling, and then the knowing with the clear development, or what I like to just call sensory perception. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, as we talk about Rosicrucianism and its tenets, so much of it got massively adulterated because of the theosophical movement of Helena Blavatsky and other things during the 19th century occult revival. So personally, I don't hold a whole lot of strong feelings towards the Rosicrucian movement as it exists right now. But if we start to go backwards to the 1600s, we begin to see that there are definitely some more virtuous types of tenets that exist inside of the entire philosophy. And it's all about being able to utilize the psychic senses of the human individual for the healing and the generation of goodwill towards all individuals. One of the basic principles of actual Rosicrucianism is that you wouldn't know that somebody's a Rosicrucian because there's no lodge. It's a secret and an invisible order. It is something that you are united in other individuals who feel that same beatific type of call or draw to the goodness of humanity and to be able to contribute, because you yourself have been able to, either by fate and fortune or dharma, life path, whatever it is, able to be in a space where you, or either through cultivation sometimes, able to offer these gifts to other individuals. You perform the healing of the sick, you perform generous donations to the poor, you perform all of these things because you are in a state where you know how to be able to attract those things to you. One of the very basic tenets of all Rosicrucian philosophy is that there is an infinite amount of healing, or we can just say health, wealth, and happiness that exists. They exist abundantly for anybody who just wants to align themselves with those principles. The principles exist. You don't have to go out and find it. It's not something external from you. It's something that is part of the pulse of all of creation. again, the case in point is that you can look at any bit of creation and it's already existing and has provided for it everything that it needs in order to be able to express itself. And like most of the Eastern philosophies would indicate, is that our sense of suffering comes from being detached from that moment and all that actually exists within it, and choosing based on our emotional resonance one state or another that is very polar in opposition to that transcendent principle.
The center point.
So yeah, exactly. If we want to call it that, again, Tao, if we want to call it that, there are many different ways of calling it. Modern Rosicrucianism claims to derive most of its teachings from ancient Egypt. And I think that that's a completely bogus and bunk claim, to be perfectly honest. They've incorporated a lot of things that they have, as a result, that were concomitant with 19th century occult revival era. There were a lot of findings about Egypt and learning about how, especially in the early 20th century, how we can understand certain aspects based on hieroglyphs and translations of things and get small little glimpses. And they've incorporated that into their philosophies these days. But the original 1600s, like the 17th century Rosicrucian movement, as it was developed, was based almost entirely on Paracelsian principle. And Paracelsian principle was a 16th century thing that basically said that everything operates in threes and divisions of threes, and that three is found within three itself. So that's why we talk about the soul, the spirit, and the body, or as we call it in alchemy, the sulfur, mercury, and salt. And within that, the salt has a sulfur, a mercury, and a salt. The mercury has a sulfur, mercury, and salt. The sulfur has a sulfur, mercury, and salt. It's a holographic and fractal principle that connects everything is composed of these three things. That's why when you said, everything basically is in divisions of nine, I would say yes. And even nine is divisions of three into itself. And again, when we take a look at brilliant mystics like Nikola Tesla, he says the exact same thing. If you only knew the powers of 3, 6, and 9, the whole world would be your oyster, not just in creating resonant frequencies with which we can power the entire earth seamlessly, but also understanding the spiritual magnitude and the spiritual presence of all of those things. And that goes back to a Paracelsian concept that everything that is spiritual has a physical corollary to it, and everything that is physical has a spiritual corollary to it, and that they are abiding by essentially the same processes. But it's like you were talking about, it's a mirror image. So here I'm on this computer screen. I'm actually physically moving my right hand, but when I look into this computer screen, it's the left hand that is moving. That is really seems to be, to me, the difference between the dynamics between heaven and earth, if we want to refer to it as that. Those are the different ways that, when we move like this up here, we're following a movement down here, but our frame of reference is like this instead of like this. And so it's a whole different pattern, or so it seems. It's actually the same pattern, just two different perspectives. And as it pertains to Paracelsian writings, he was very, very widely traveled. He came back and he got rid of the dualistic cosmology of alchemy in its entirety, as it had existed from the point of Jabir in the West, coming up with this sulfur mercury theory, saying that sulfur is masculine, mercury is feminine. Paracelsus says no. The world is divided into threes. It's always in all things. There's the soul, and the soul is the direct opposite of the body. Those are the two opposing mirror images, if you want to look at it like that. But there's a third thing. There's all of that space in between. He says that is spirit. That is the animating life force. And Mercury, as a result of being that spirit, is neither here nor there. It can be here and there, and it's everywhere in between simultaneously. It is the unifying aspect between these polar, seemingly polar opposite substances. And in that way, he said that everything is composed of sulfur, mercury, and salt, which is to say everything contains a soul, a spirit, and a body. And he talks about even the soul having a soul, a spirit, and a body. He talks about the body as having a soul, a spirit, and a body, and all of those things holographically and fractally being composed of those same types of things. And that's the entirety of alchemy since his time, including what the Rosicrucians ended up taking, ended up utilizing that cosmology to explain things in the West, which realistically puts things directly back into a universal current that extends back at least 10,000 years to Rig Veda in the Vedic tradition, where they say realistically everything can be separated into Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, whether we call that Rajas, Tejas, and Ojas, whether we refer to this as Xing, Qi, Shun. All of these things are essentially the exact same principles, guiding principles, in terms of the divisions of three that we are able to see. And I really like the Taoist cosmology of it as it pertains to the human organism, because, your Xing is going to be like the wax of the candle, Qi to the flame of the candle, Shun to the light that the candle puts out. And when we talk about the balance of these three universal principles within the human organism, we can see that so many people, like for instance, are using red ginseng regularly out of context, right? It's a very heating herb. It's very hot and it's very dry and it's heating. So it will increase the size of the qi because the flame itself is hot and dry. So it increases your qi, but what does that do to your jing? That decreases the candle wax and melts the candle wax. The brighter that the flame becomes, the bigger that flame becomes, it puts off for a short period of time more shun, more light, because the flame is so big, but it decreases the jing. It decreases the lifespan of the individual massively. It just completely breaks apart kidney jing in particular. And prenatal jing is oftentimes in American society these days, modern world society, prenatal jing is almost entirely expended by the time a person is in their mid-20s. You're pretty much just relying on whatever jing is inside of the kidney from diet and lifestyle and cultivation, qigong, etc. But I think that it's really important that we don't rely on these external physical sources in order to keep the balance internally of where we're at. Herbs can help to remedy an imbalance in one way or the other. They can take care of the five fundamental, within Taoist cosmology, the five fundamental elements and their balance in restoring Jing, Qi, and Shun really, really well. But when we rely upon them to counterbalance our own imbalances that exist internally, we're only creating further imbalances. You're just adding imbalance to imbalance when lifestyle, diet, thoughts, emotions, all these things are already out of balance. No herb will work. I think it's in Ayurveda that the phrase comes where they say that if medicine, if diet and lifestyle are already in place, medicine is of no use. If medicine is being used without reference to diet and lifestyle, then it's really not going to work. It's something like that. And I think that very same basis can be applied on the level of consciousness, not just physiological wellness, that unless we are already more or less spiritually aligned and have a sense of integrity between these three aspects of ourselves, there's no chance that other things like qigong or tai chi are going to really help us to maintain and get into those spaces, because they themselves are physical form, physical movement that allow for the channeling of qi, that allow for the movement of qi through the organs. You have to open up the qi, you have to open up the jing, you have to open up shun initially as a possibility and a potential, and realize that the movements that you do not channel those things. You can run through the movements Same thing in Gong Fu. You can run through all the movements that you want. The power of it is the integration of the spiritual forces and the acknowledgement of what you're doing. There's so many great martial artists that I'm learning from all the time. I've studied a lot of different forms of martial arts myself as well. But one of the things that I absolutely love about it is within the concept of Shaolin Gong Fu. See, some of the best masters, the greatest Zifu of today, they end up telling us that Qi, the way that it's thought of with, all of these Western Guai that teach you like, oh, and there are even some actual Chinese too that will do this, where they'll like try to concentrate their Qi and like throw you off course and all these other things. You can only be thrown off course by that individual if you choose to be thrown off course by that individual. If you are firm already in your state, their Qi is not going to be powerful enough to overcome your Qi until it becomes integrated into the body and into the mind simultaneously, Jing Qi Shun aligned, in which case that transfer of Qi is actually a body mechanics type of thing and the alignment of the mind. The mind, in order to not be thrown off center, must also be firm, must be grounded. Horse stance can allow us that opportunity to develop that firmness and that grounding, but on its own, horse stance can also be thrown off. The mind must be aligned with it. And when those two are aligned, the qi comes, which is to say that the body, the salt, and the soul, the mind, the consciousness, have to be more or less on that same page, in which case the mercury, then, the spirit, the qi, the life force that animates those things, is able to flow through them properly. And we see the very same thing in the Ayurvedic or in the Vedic stance when we talk about Pitta being this very sattvic force. Sattva, it's enlightenment. It's a very strong form of goodness. And then we see density, on the other side of that, this very kapha-oriented force. And what binds them is this kind of animating force of vata, the air, the space that kind of aligns everything. And we see that there are these principles inside of all of these great traditions. And if I were to point to the Egyptian tradition, or if I were to point to, sadly, we don't have so much of it still existing either in written or in oral form, but Mayan cosmology, Incan cosmology, anytime that Babylonian cosmology, when we take a look at these great traditions, they all end up through their own sets and perspectives telling us essentially the very same thing, that we have to align ourselves and be very, very solid in order to open up our entire multidimensional potential and our gifts, and to allow for the human expression in its most optimized form to be able to flow. So anyway, as you were talking, those were some of the insights that I was thinking and just kind of drawing back to things that I can relate to.
Yeah, no, I think that's amazing. You probably want to sit down for what I'm going to tell you next. The real misdirection within Taoist alchemy is when people are given a limitation. It's kind of like understanding when someone is basically enters the soul to this physical form and the creation of the 9-month cycle that produces human life at its full development. There's that culmination or realization of this constitution we like to call Jing, which is basically, hey, look, I always tell people, you come in with a battery pack. The reason people gravitate to Taoism is because immortality is our bag, baby. We are into the understanding of everything is abundant, timeless, endless, limitless, infinite. And all the teaching that I've ever seen within a Taoist practice has been in this diluted misdirection of a limitation. It just doesn't exist. So what does that mean? It means that someone has a battery pack. You come in, your constitution, your hereditary genetic disposition, how you perceive your life as you know it, from your ancestors is giving you this flesh and blood, and on a panel of blood work, whatever, you're going to get a framework of what your DNA expression is. The truth is, as a Taoist, you come in, you got a battery. I've never seen anyone at 100% of their potential. Normally about 80 to 70 is just what they're born into. And then this is the magical part about Taoist alchemy, the stuff I teach, is you take it up to 100, and then from 100 you go to 1,000, from 1,000 you go to 10,000, and it's really it's limitless. But let's just say I like hovering around the 9,000 mark of my human potential, making sure that everything is saturated at a subatomic level. We are saturating this human expression of what people perceive as you, and so that means that you're resonating and bringing in what is not of this electromagnetic spectrum. With that, whenever I channel, and this is an old school thing, I had a friend of the channel, David Verdesi, who's been pursuing, ancient cultivating superhuman types. And I've traveled the world training under some of these people. Only twice in my lifetime have I ever seen someone that's truly mastered Kundalini exploration and mastery. When people talk about, I've had a Kundalini awakening, I can see you've energetically have potential for that, but that's not exactly what that is. When you have a Kundalini awakening, you're levitating, you're stopping your heart, you're doing supernatural things that have taken a cultivational processes, which is what we call the internal alchemy. And I've only ever seen 2 people that can levitate. And that's cool. And I'm not dismissing anyone else's experience, and you're getting the charge. You know what I'm saying is true. This is cool. But when I'm talking about, when I get into the magnetic fluidity, which is the yin, which is the source to all things, the mother of all things, let people hear that very carefully. We call it the mother. We don't call it the father. We don't call it something else. So understanding the true center point and what that reveals to your experience in this duality, that you bring in this beyond the spectrum, what some people call superhuman, this energy that is all things, which is the perfection that you are being returned to, remembering, is abundant, timeless, endless, limitless, infinite. And so if anyone acknowledges the idea that this is a micro of a macro, what part of that do you get a memo that this is limited? And that's the misdirection. This is where this has been going on for thousands of years. And one of the biggest, I'm going to say it, it's almost like a joke, to nurture your jing, to abstain from sexual intercourse is a lie. And I even personally, you cultivate that energy. I become even more concentrated in that moment of ecstasy, and I just gather it. I absorb it. And you don't have to internalize it from a physical response to an alchemical process that people would call bliss, orgasm, whatever you want to call it. That is the potential of your alchemical magic, mystical processes that you get from having this human body. What happens when that happens is you're creating the center point again. Just another way to do it. It's an expression of that. That resonance is then limitless. Like if you want to create any type of like magic, a magic within Taoism is way different than what people perceive it as, because there's a karmic model that goes rippling over the universe. But listen to what that says. There's principles, there's laws. I always stop for a second when someone uses this type of terminology, because it's referring to an absolute. The universe doesn't have a moral compass. It's abundant, timeless, endless, limitless, infinite. And so when you frame things out like this, you're becoming separate in of itself. And it's designed that way. It's designed for this very misdirection. So when you get to that center point, all bets are off as to what your potential is. But from a alchemical process for a Taoist magic, where we use star stepping, we got our relationship with the universe. It's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, not tens, not six, it's like people blows their mind and they go, but that's not what the history tells us. But for some reason that makes sense to me and I feel it. Yeah, well, I could get into a conference with the Jade Emperor or the Yellow Emperor or the three Pure ones, and we can get down with an understanding of what that really means as a facet of consciousness, spiritual consciousness. But that misdirection is the biggest, it's a punishment to someone who gets trapped in that path where they get caught in these sort of lenses of processes. It's infinite. Everything is. And so, but you have to be there. You have to actually be able to create that knowing, that gnosis, that ability to be this present moment, and your consciousness is the default of all things. There is a process to that. So it's fundamentally just like, no, you're wrong. I was taught that, there's a limit to the human Jing. There's a limit to the human potential. If you even think that, if you want to entertain the idea that this is a micro of a macro, then the potential is limitless. And so that signature resonance is the truth, not this, you're limited by, now for a Taoist, the truth is highest ascension is knowing and channeling direct source. You are self-evident. You are gnosis. You are now. It's no one else. And that, I think, is a reflection that's one of the things that I saw in the traits of some of the leftover Rosicrucian stuff that I enjoyed listening to, because there was a slither of what I consider truth in the information that's coming through. But I will put out a caveat that there's a process to this abundance, timeless, endless, limitless, infinite. And if you are still subject to your personality, emotional content, and you're not able to be operating in all dimensions at once, there will be a rippling effect on what you perceive as reality. So there's a developmental skill that comes with it.
The personality itself is mortal.
Right.
If you are identifying only on that level of the body with its personality, the color of your skin, the color of your hair, the color of your eyes, the sound of your voice, the clothes that you wear, how you choose to identify those things, you can't take those with you. They don't move from one dimension to the next. That's here. That's this. You have to identify with the perennial principle of the soul and of the spirit. That is the talents, the interests, the inherent gifts, the connection to that source, the connection to the Tao, and find it with that Qi. Otherwise, like you said, then you obtain a certain octave of Jing. You obtain that higher expression. We see, especially, even not so long ago, San Qing, not so long ago, there were herbalists still living remotely in China who were living for 180 years, 200 years. And before that, people were living for so long, when we go back 6,000, 8,000 years within the Taoist tradition, that they were literally just considered the immortals.
That's what we call it.
Yeah, exactly. The Taoist immortals. Now, here's the thing that I think is really important from my perspective as a practical alchemist, because, for some reason in the West in particular, but this has also happened in the East, in the West, the concept of alchemy got fragmented from, you're a laboratory alchemist. Okay, that's great. Do you do spiritual alchemy? It's the same thing. When we're working with the chemicals in the laboratory, when we're working on our experiments with the herbs and the minerals and each one of the individual processes and the four elements that trigger and help to elicit the changes from one phase to the next, we're seeing a diagram, a model play out for us that teaches us and explicitly lays out the instruction for how to be able to transfer that to the soul, because the recognition is that this herb, this plant, this material, this metal has its soul, its spirit, and its body. And when we perform a particular process on it, we can see that we're performing one of different types of purification processes on one of those aspects of that material. Sometimes on two at once, but very rarely. It's usually, like, for instance, the principle of extraction. In that case, you're always extracting the soul. And what do you extract the soul with? You extract the soul with spirit. We even use that term in English today when we talk about alcohol, which is a vegetable mercury, a vegetable spirit. When we pour the spirit over the herb, and, like, for instance, in Buddhist cosmology, they would say, well, with spirit, the ego dissolves. In the flask that we see, there is an herb, and that herb has an essential oil to it. The essential oil doesn't degrade very easily, and it binds to the spirit no matter what, so that even if we were to distill that alcohol after that essential oil has been dissolved inside that alcohol, if we distill that alcohol, the essential oil flies over with it. We call that the marriage between the red king and the white queen. And of course, when you see that in alchemical allegory and in other things, they specifically illustrate that in the metallic works when working with gold in particular. That's when you see it. But still, the red king and the white queen is an allegory all the time, where the mercury is the white queen and the sulfur, the essential oil, and in the vegetable kingdom is going to be the red king. And they will combine and they marry and they indelibly fly together, which is to say that once they get distilled, they come over together. You can't separate them through distillation or through any specific process alone. They are now always together. But then this leaves behind another grade of soul, doesn't it? This leaves behind what we are now referring to as most of the active constituents inside of that plant that contain the color of that plant. And they contain some of the alkaloids of those plants, because alkaloids are not essential oils. They're not volatile aromatic compounds, etc. So they stay behind. All of those things degrade, and they can degrade very easily just by heat and light exposure, the very sources of nature, whereas the essential oil does not. It will last and still smell good for an exceptionally long time, such to the degree that for all intents and purposes, it is almost immortal. And it has been spiritualized with that mercury. Whereas this lower soul, the personality, which is really to say not the components of our talents, our interests, our virtues, but rather the value systems of who we are and how we come across physically. That aspect of the soul is mortal and it stays behind. Now, it still does have medicinal value in its own right. And that's why, I will teach, for instance, within my work of transpersonal alchemy, I always teach my students, based on the lab models that I can see, the personality isn't to be eliminated. The personality is to channel these higher things. When you can align this lower aspect of the personality, the soul, the body, etc., with these higher aspects of the spirit and the higher soul, now you have a completely integrated organism. You have a completely integrated individual. But that's why the lab practice, to me, is so critically fundamental, is that when you're performing the laboratory work, you get to see the living diagrams that play out in front of you that give you precisely the methodology that is necessary to perform the work internally. And if you use a quantum state of observation, for lack of a better term, I'm going to borrow that term of quantum, meaning that the observer is creating through the process of observation. So as we observe this thing, that's what I mean by the quantum state of observation. Observation is creation. When we observe this thing, we are creating this transformation within ourselves and initiating the processes, the very same processes that our materials are going through, with the acknowledgement that we are all things, that we are this herb and we are that herb and these minerals and those minerals and that metal and these and anything that you can work on. You are that. And therefore, that thing corresponds to a certain aspect within the individual, within the operator, within the alchemist. And by observing through the active state that says, I am this, when you transform this, you simultaneously transform this. Now you have to be present fully and wholly in order to be able to get that message completely. But as it relates to Taoist alchemy, this is why I think that the tradition has been so diluted, San Qing, for so many centuries.
It's not, none of it's real stuff. The stuff I teach is real. I've yet to see it. And I mean, it's been coming back for decades. And it's just fragmented. It's filtered. people steal things. There are people making a lot of money selling really expensive books that are just absolute gobbledygook, and they're everywhere.
Well,
It's
and
rampant.
such is true, but it would weed it all out if just one practitioner, just one, were to start to perform the sublimatory works, the sublimations, which was primarily, that's where the all the different chen, all the different cauldrons came from. Is that in Taoist alchemy initially they would build clay vessels, and there would be the first vessel, the lower burner, that you put your materials in. And these would typically be dry materials. Sometimes they'd be sulfur, and sometimes they'd be mercury, or different combinations thereof, especially in the creation of mercury sulfide. But they would have different types of ores and different types of pigments and different types of herbs that would go into the lower burner. Then they would have a middle burner. And this middle burner was also a cauldron, but it could be turned on its side to allow vapors to continue to pass up inside of this column, or it could be turned upside down in order for a condensation and a circulation to happen just between lower and middle burner, or it could be removed depending on the work entirely. And then there would be a top burner, and the same thing. This could be facing upwards, this could be facing downwards. And what would end up happening is that you would create different circulation. The whole concept in Negung of circulation of the light literally is shown 100% in the actual sublimation capacity that happens in the laboratory. And when people, if one person who is really interested in Taoism, the way that the immortals practiced, they practiced in the same way that the Western alchemist practices, with the actual physical things. And then they relate those internal processes and say, look, inside of you, you are the same thing as this entire distillation train, this circulatory vessel of these three cauldrons. When you heat this, your lower burner, and you turn your middle burner to the side, which is to say to disassociate from the individuality, in what would we call this in kind of the Vedic terminology, middle burner exists where solar plexus chakra is. Solar plexus chakra oftentimes deals with sense of self and ego. But again, we tilt this way so that the vapors can continue to rise. And it hits the top vessel. The space between what is being volatilized down at lower burner and what is existing up at higher burner end up being so different that a material can go from vapor, or from a solid to a vapor back to a solid, without ever hitting the liquid phase. And that is the process of sublimation, and that is a circulation that ends up happening. And so when we talk about that golden pill that ends up dripping down the back of the throat after we perform circulation of the light properly, that is the sublimated vapor, essentially, that ends up providing the individual with that sense of immortality. Why do people these days teach this work so frequently and don't actually have a physiological context for it? It gives room for so much adulteration and interpretation of what the ancients must have meant. Or I practice this so much and I got this sensation, so I pass that on to my students as a teaching, that ends up diluting the entire tradition. And I can pinpoint the different phases around 3,000 years ago where a lot of the Taoist authors used to say, yeah, they used to work with chemicals, but it's very dangerous, so we stopped doing that. Well, no, bullshit. You didn't learn it, was the thing. You didn't take it upon yourself to actually do it. You deemed it as being too dangerous, because if those things were actually that dangerous, your immortals wouldn't have existed. They would have died, and you would have called them crackpots instead of immortals. But instead, they not only were able to completely do the physical and the internal work, but they were able to make a medicine, a substance that was physically imbibable, that would prolong lifespans virtually indefinitely, as far as the human organism is concerned, at any rate. Even if you could live the lifespan of 5 or 6 normal human individuals, that is decent enough for me to say that you're damn near immortal. But we don't have people doing that anymore because they're distanced from the actual tradition. They're distanced from what the actual teaching is. And does it take a great deal of skill to work in the laboratory to not hurt yourself? Yes. And do you have to start at a with much safer materials than the metallic and mineral vapors that that they were writing about? Absolutely, that would be smart because you have to try your hand and you have to work up your energy field to be able to handle these more complicated things. Because what's true, what is absolutely true, is that metals are the most pure consciousness on the entire planet. They are only one element repeated over and over and over in their constitution to a crystalline degree that they become that metal. They are the most pure aspects of consciousness because they are only one thing. A mineral is a little less pure, but it's more complex. So we may have, say, instead of potassium as a pure metal, we now have potassium chloride, where a chlorine gas acts upon that. Now it's two things. It's less pure, but it's more complex. And then we get plants that are feeding off of these minerals inside of the soil with the help of millions of different types of bacteria, fungi, archaea, etc., and growing in sort of a terrestrial matrix, a telluric matrix of soil. And they are much less pure. Now they have tons of different metals and minerals inside of them. And they also have all of these new bioactive compounds. So they're far less pure. And then you have animals, less pure even than that. And then you have humans, the least pure of all forms of physical existence, but the most complex because we contain all of the rest of those things inside of us. The animals, they eat the plants. The plants, they eat the minerals. The minerals are acted upon by gases and carbon, for instance, oxygen, nitrogen, etc. And those create our nitrates and our oxides and our carbonates and carbides and things like this. And so there's this definitive scale of consciousness in terms of purity and complexity. We have the consciousness as human beings that we do because we are so complex and we are composed of everything else. So when we can acknowledge that we're working on these, more pure materials than ourselves, like a vegetable, for instance, or an animal material, which are a little bit more pure than ourselves because they are less complex, we begin to regain aspects of purity and step by step reinitiate ourselves into the inner workings of all of the things around us. And we begin to remember that we are that, not just conceptually, existentially. We begin to recognize when I worked on that thing, this thing inside of myself opened up and blossomed like the lotus. And so I know that I am that. Why? Because that aspect has opened back up inside of me. All the way till we get back to the metals and we realize that each different metal has such unique crystalline characteristic to it that they are embodied crystalline virtues of cosmic creation made manifest in physical form. And when we work on those, it takes basically all of the concentration of the individual to begin to remember these very small in number, but very pure aspects of our cosmic consciousness as they can exist in crystalline form here on this planet. And we begin to open these back up. And so for me, this has always been kind of the point, is that I can demonstrate this within the Western tradition because I know the Western tradition like the back of my hand. I've studied I'm particularly a student of Paracelsus and Basil Valentine, who Basil Valentine and Paracelsus are essentially the same individual. And when I say essentially, I mean, there's no physical character that we can prove that existed named Basil Valentine, but the writings and the pharmacopoeia and what they were talking about and the way that they conceive of things it's the exact same language. If you know Paracelsus backward and forward, you know Basil Valentine, that it's the exact same thing. That being said, I've studied lots of other things, the epistles of Ali Puli, the works of just about Isaac Holland, all of the major alchemists in the Western tradition. I know about them, and I know about them in the Arabic tradition that preceded the tradition here. And apparently the Arabs got it from the Greeks, and so we know some of the Greek authors, and then the Greeks got it from the Egyptians, and so we have little bits of records, especially now with hieroglyphic translations. We know enough about what was happening in ancient Egypt by that pathway of alchemy. So I've got a pretty firm handle on what I can with the Western tradition. And in the East, there's still a living tradition of Rasa Shastra in India, in the Himalayas. They are still performing the alchemy, and they're still saints, and they're still using it and making the medicines out of it. That tradition has been dead in China for so many hundreds of years now. There may be some obscure person, especially in the northern mountains, that maybe is still practicing, but that would that would separate the wheat from the chaff, San Qing, in being able to show what the actual Taoist practices are by reinvigorating the alchemical practices, not just psychologically, mentally, emotionally, the subtle energy channels, but the physical channels that those things correspond to. It would dispel all doubt, and people would know once and for all, here is exactly what the ancient Taoists were talking about, our Taoist immortals were talking about. Why? Because we can see with our own eyes, we can feel with our own hearts exactly this process. And that's why I'm such an advocate for people, even if they're not called to being, a professional alchemist or whatever, or working with actual materials, to at least step into the laboratory and to begin to experience it, because it gives them that working diagrammatic model that shows without any shadow of a doubt exactly how the processes of transformation work, and it shows what elements are necessary in order to trigger those processes, and how to be able to feel those processes internally as you see these things externally. It's the unification of spirit and matter in those moments. So
yeah, no, I agree with you, and I mean, I've probably spent the last almost 30 years teaching people these processes, but they go away. If it's material, it's at the lowest level. We need to understand this. An incantation right from the Jet Emperor: power abundant in its giving you will receive, unifying the body with the spirit with the energy, bringing heaven to earth, transcending all is one, one is all, perfection manifest. That is your gift, that is your offering. That is your gift, that is your offering. That is your gift, that is your offering. So, in essence, the material is the lowest energy, frequency, vibration. That's the pinnacle, the essence, the present moment. And so I'm about to share with you some processes that will contradict your very understanding of internal alchemy or Nidan practices, Nigong training, because this is the keeper is supreme purity, the sun, the light. This is jade purity, the information, the earth, and the lowest dantian, which will contradict everything that you know, is highest purity, the moon, the energy, the magic. And so you are now going into dantians. We have 81 chambers in each dantian, which has a pattern, and they merge together, forming the processes where you can separate electric from magnetic, shock people, charge people, do all that sort of wonderment, envelop my forearm, run a skewer through it. That's a party trick I like freaking people out with. This is just energy, but you're permeating the physical tissue with a substance that is perfection. It's not from this dimension. And so when you do that, like when I cultivate or I channel or I do anything like that, I can literally put my hand over a flame for minutes on end if I want to, pull it off, and there's no damage to the tissue, because you're taking a wave that is not, it's perfection. It's not the limited construct or offering of what we perceive in this 3D. So that imprint, and what you do is you imprint it, these imprinting aspects are really quite profound, because the evidence is evident for the seeker. The gnosis, the knowing, is holy moly, I've just been given this incredible vortices of perfection in this space. And I do this all the time with people. I set it up within their space, and they literally go, oh, well, maybe he was hypnotizing me, or maybe it was just something that was just a very moment. I just felt so blissful. And they come back the next day to the very spot, which is constructed of many different things. And it's as if they're sitting on a fire hydrant of perfection. And they're like, holy shit, how is this part? It doesn't go anywhere. What it does do, which I notice is the first side effect before I program it, is it turns off your Wi-Fi. And like, it's crazy how this weird sort of like perfection has such a profound effect on things that are clearly detrimental within this spectrum, right? So, you look at it and you go, oh, holy moly. And of course, you just transmute that however you need it to be. But when I say this, it's not a throwaway. There's a processes to master these states so it's palpable and it's self-evident. It's not a figment of your imagination, or, as you said, when people are moving energy, and it's because they're psychologically accepting this energy state that they will move with the practitioner that wants to, project a far jinn, or whatever they want to call it, the energy, the chi. Trust me, when I enter into your fascia, you don't have an option. And that's part of the martial aspect of it. And that's where people get kind of freaked out. It's like, I've wrapped myself with protection. I've got 47 angels. I will resonate your body at a high frequency. How did you do that? Because you are me, I am you. Unfortunately, you're subject to, when we get back to what I was talking about, the karmic model, which is sort of really different within Taoism, because the karmic model relies not on, we don't believe in good and bad. Yin and yang has nothing to do with good and bad. They are polarizing, self-evident effects of this reality until otherwise noted, until you enter the center point of the Wu Ji, the stillness, the mother of all things. You will be limited by. And that's okay, because this is part of your exploration, seeking all things. Yet, that's how magic works. So when I construct magic, it has a rippling effect on the individual that is subject to karma. That means that they've got this moral, sort of like limited humanistic sort of perception of the human condition, which comes in the trait of their emotional state and how they perceive their reality, good and bad, up and down, in and out. I don't construct it to have any effect on anyone, yet it alters the rippling effects of this what we would call the quantum 3D reality, even though this has been taken from perfection, and now it resets someone to remember who they are. But the side effects of that may be, unfortunately, limited by that person's perspective. So that means that, what does that mean? If you go on your virtue signaling, which we like to call it, because within which highest purity reminds me all the time, when someone says they are a good person, you know the answer to that. When you are virtue signaling, if you're actually acting virtuous, you have no virtue at all. This is part of the dualistic model. This is like you are gravitating to something that you are deficient in by expressing yourself through your very words, your very actions, your very humanness. And so these things are all so complex, but that's what karma is really about. And it's sort of to trap the practitioner, the seeker, into the idea that things are limited and that you need to be fearful of the outcome. Once you resonate at that high level of cultivation, you're not looking to, dominate and be a dictator to millions of people, or a slayer of people's dreams, or, put yourself in a place that is limited to destroying the human construct. You are now. And that, with that, it bears the fruit of raising the spiritual consciousness, and people just resonate at that high point. If you want to look at it as a brainwave, you're at that 40, 50, 60 hertz and above. And this is where I get really conflicted when people talk about, oh my goodness, Stephen Hawkins has this consciousness scale. And I'm like, yeah, sorry. I've witnessed physical healings. When I channel physical healings, my brainwaves, I've measured them above 40, anywhere from 40 up to 400 hertz. Trust me, and even at 400 hertz, which on a Hawkins scale means that I'm still having issues of conflict of my emotional state. I watch bones fuse in front of my very eyes. I watch flesh turn back to its original state. My first hit of a spiritual crack pipe, I'm just going to be funny about it, was 30 years ago when I bear witness to gangrenous flesh turn back to pink in color in 40 minutes. And that was through my teacher showing me what's possible. So the possibility for me on a daily basis at this point is witnessing this low-level material healing and mind-blowing people to go, hey, wow. Have you noticed that it's like you reference spirit, and spirit is an interesting thing, yet there's this ominous energy that is attached to it that, 30 years ago from a Taoist model, one of the very techniques and one of the methods that I was trained in deeply was activating my yin eyes. And, exorcisms were a run-of-the-mill daily sort of thing. And people are like, what? I thought that was a Catholic thing. It's in all mystical processes. It's in all understanding, but it's a subject.
Go points,
Right. It's a subject of the individual's journey. And basically, you're attuning this physical flesh with being commandeered by a limited viewpoint, even though you're operating in all dimensions at once. You are calling out for these type of energies, and they will find you if that's something that you're into. And it's not about being fearful. It's just about you are fearful, so fear will find you. The universe goes, oh, you're afraid. You want more. Okay. Oliver Twist, you want more? Can I have some more, sir? And it will be realized instantaneously, and they're very tangible. They're very real. And what does that mean? Well, it means that, these Hollywood fantasized versions of demonic forces or satanic forces like Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers, all these massacre, murder, horror archetypes. Listen, the reality is, it came from the deep bowels of Wes Craven's demented view of reality being commandeered by something greater, and it was formed. That means that it's energy, frequency, vibration. That means that if you really want to play with that, I can bring it forward and you can entertain yourself with what kind of obscurely, weirdly skewed frequency that is, but it's very tangible because we get back to the truth, which is energy, frequency, vibration. We get back to all things. People go to Chinese medicine, and the 4 pillars are quite simple: energy, herbology, massage, and acupuncture. And every one of those fail, and people always end up going back to the energetics. And the reason that you go so deep and are so powerful of what you do is you're already in tune with imprinting this stuff at a frequency that's beyond all things. If anyone takes any of your stuff, it's like their head blows off because it's your alchemical process is already integrated into all things, and you're just taking that material and turning it into perfection. And when they induce it, when they take it in, it resets everything to now. And people go, holy crap, what did you put in this? How is this possible that you could create this little tincture and it's like doing what you said it was going to do? Because I'm just giving you a little slice of perfection, and it's doing what it does for your limited human expression and bringing you back to the truth, remembering. And that's what I love about this stuff. So when you mentioned that, that, I'm sort of like progressively moving in that space where the amount of things that we open and share on an alchemical process, I use what they call the infinite internal Wuji body, which would make a Kundalini experience seem like a little infantile gnat version. And that process evokes what we call the sacred infinite flower. And that sacred infinite flower reveals all things, accessing the center point. So that light is at a highest level. In some ways, some people will talk about the alchemical processes within the cauldrons. That's awesome. But I promise you, when you use the processes that I show you, you're going to have a whole new definition of what that means, being able to literally do as you are intended to do, which is restore perfection. And that resonance just happens to be the magical evidence of what people call impossible. They call it superhuman. And that's really none of the above. It's actually who you really are. But you have to, it's a human hetero action response, which, what does that mean for layman's that may not be getting a dose of psychology or hypnosis? It means that what you start, you must finish. That's the human programming that you're starting with.
you